what's coming up next? What do I think here?
All right, let's do this. Welcome to the Hackaday podcast. My name is Mike Szczys. I'm editor-in-chief of Hackaday.
Hey, I'm Elliot Williams. I'm managing editor of Hackaday.
This is episode 127. Today we're talking about Whippletree clamps, sniffing your stomach radio, multimeter hum fix, and a C64 demo, no C64. Elliot, it's been a sad week for NTSC.
Has it really?
Apparently, you will no longer be able to watch over-the-air NTSC broadcasts because the low power stations the time has just run out on them and you can no longer broadcast. There was an exemption in for LPCA and TX licenses in the low power Class A broadcast translator, but it has run out, so it's digital from here on out.
Have you been watching a lot of analog TV?
I can't say I have.
Exactly.
But it is an interesting thing to think about, and Jenny talks about this, is like when you have these over-the-air analog broadcasts, people who want to do something with radio frequency have something to play with in a way that digital is not quite the same experience, because you have to figure out what to do with the digital signal in a way that you don't with analog signals.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a lot of our radios here, I live in Germany, a lot of our radios here have switched over to digital broadcasting as well. And so like if you go tooling around with an old analog radio, you're like, there aren't any channels anymore. What's going on?
You know, I don't have an RTL SDR, but I have a bunch of things in mind for one. And one of those is like in my car, some stations will tell you what is playing, like the artist and the track that's playing in text. And so I'd love to just do a little afternoon hack where you figure out how to pull that data out of the airwaves.
Spoilers, it's been done.
Oh, I'm sure it's been done, but not by me.
Yeah, exactly. Well, don't look into... No, actually, that's a good thing to do with GNU Radio. I was going to say don't look into doing it with GNU Radio because it's really easy. There's just like a pre-compiled thingus.
You just press a button and it shows up.
Exactly. You just drag the demodulator up there and drag one line to it. But you could totally do it by hand, too. And doing that by hand is actually an awesome exercise in radio foolery.
Yeah, and I think you'd start using the tool that knows how to do it, so that as proof that like your hardware's set up and working and you're on the right frequency and that station actually has the data you're looking for, right?
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah, and then you can look under and be like, well, what is that demodulator actually doing for me? So, you know, just those kind of like hello world with radio sort of things.
Yeah, you can see it. It's off at like 75 kilohertz off to the side. So you can actually see it pretty easily in like a spectrum analyzer. It's a good thing to do. Do it. Let me know what you see.
Yeah, well, let's see what else is new this week. The Hackaday prize is switching over. So this is the final weekend for you to get on the work from home challenge part of the Hackaday prize, which is a lot of people have been working from home that weren't over the last year. I know a lot of the Hackaday crew were already work from home people. You obviously have figured out ways to make it work for you. So like workstations that keep your work area separate from your home area, or like Pomodoro timers that keep you healthy so you're not just like staring at a screen non-blinking for 17 hours while your spine atrophies. All of these sorts of things are great entries for the Hackaday prize, and you have until Monday to get those in.
And that brings us to, what's that sound?
This is a journey into sound. What's that sound?
What's that sound?
All right, for people who are new to the podcast, Elliot is going to play a sound, and we want you to guess what it is. So I've not heard this yet. Let's take it away, Elliot. It is synthesized keyboard and pan flute.
So like the week before last, we've been doing some like heavy electronics-y things. Sometimes I think we got to throw in a little culture. So this one is popular geek culture.
It sounds a lot like Twin Peaks.
No.
Is that not it?
That is not it. No.
Oh.
Not at all.
Is it?
It is.
Oh, yeah.
Da, 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 da.
All right.
Random guessing. Mike has finally stumbled on. No, that was good. It just took you a few seconds.
In music school, must have been theory class, they had these drop the needle tests where you'd like study like medieval music history, and then your midterm, they would take like they'd just start in the middle of a track. And you used to have to buy these huge anthologies of compact discs. They were really expensive. And maybe some of the students in the class would go in together and then burn copies of them. But I have no evidence of that. But the thing I learned is you always want to listen for a specific instrument that's idiomatic to that piece. And I think if you do that for this one, you will get it as I did.
Not bad. Not bad. That's a good strategy. Anyway, I think that a successful answer to this one will have to be extraordinarily specific, and I bet you there will be a ton.
I hope so, yeah.
So good luck, everybody. If there are a number of correct answers, we will random number it off, send a t-shirt out to the lucky winner.
Yeah, so go to our show notes, which you'll find at hackaday.com/podcast, to this week's episode, which is the July 16th episode. And there will be a link to a form there. Tell us your email address, the name you want us to say on the podcast if we draw your name, and your specific answer for what this is.
And without further ado, let's get down to the hacks. What do you got this week?
I picked this one that is a little NFC antenna project. And there's nothing really groundbreaking here except for the fact that people usually don't make these for themselves. It's usually something that you could just buy in a module form, and unless you just happen to be designing a product that needs an NFC antenna in this. And in this case, RevK wanted to build one that had a smaller footprint and had a few custom features that modules didn't provide without, having a large footprint or something else. And so takes the reference design, lays it down, and we find out that it's not really black magic, even though it is radio signals.
I don't believe that he couldn't find the right model at all. I think that's ex post justification. I think he wanted to build himself a module and then feels like he has to justify it after the fact. You don't, man.
The thing I was interested in, though, is where the antenna part came from, because I didn't see it in the data sheet. And that's kind of what I was really interested in seeing. You would think that there's a reference design for the trace antenna for it somewhere. So maybe I just didn't see it in those pages. But while I was looking for it, I came across an interesting tidbit, which is HSU, high speed UART, something I'm not really familiar with before. I went and tried to look it up, and I couldn't find like a concrete definition of it. The chip, which is the PN532 in the datasheet, says that this high-speed UART has up to 1.288 megabits per second, which is blazingly fast compared to the 115,200 bits per second that I'm used to on a lot of these developments. Have you run into HSU at all, Elliot?
Not by name, for sure. I think the FTDI chips will do 3 megabits or something like that. So I mean, you can push them really far, but I didn't know it had a name.
I saw that the ESP32, when you're using it with Platform IO or really anything, Arduino or really anything, you can set it to 50 million bits per second, 50 megabits per second. But I don't know if that's actually...
I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah. I just always left it at 115,200 because I think that's like one of the defaults. And for the stuff that I do, I mean, it's very slow in microcontroller terms, but I've never really run out of bandwidth for anything that I've been doing. I suppose if you're plotting a bunch of measurements, you might run out of it. I'm not sure that you really need high frequency here. I guess NFC can transmit data. Like you can actually transmit programs between NFC, right? So I think if you're going to transmit like an app between Android phones, then you definitely need some high frequency stuff going on. So I could see it being useful there. In this case, RevK is building a custom access to his house, it sounds like, because part of this design has connections for a doorbell button. And then the other thing is there's a tamper switch that's built into this feature. So you can put like a sensor on the case that you put this in. And if you open the case and the button gets unpressed, the chip will like flip a bit that you can check every time you go to do access. Like, has it been tampered with? Has it been tampered with? You can just keep checking that. And when it has been tampered with, you can say, oh, we're not allowing access anymore.
Oh, that's cute. That's definitely something you would want to put on the outside of your house if you're worried about esoteric electronic cyber ninjas breaking in.
Probably safer than my metal key.
My guess is they'll just kick a window in. But
You're very right.
my first hack this week is a 3D printing version of a tool that I'd never seen before, and everything here is interesting. The 3D prints are interesting, the old tool is interesting, and the kind of greater sociological picture is cool too. Our story starts off with Fractal Vice holds odd-shaped objects tight. And this is a 3D printed model by Chris Borge. But what this vise really can do is conform to oddly shaped things and hold them in between them. And it does that by having 8 fingers on either side, all of them kind of quasi-independently movable. Each pair of end fingers has a pivot that rests on another pair of fingers before it, that rests on another pair before that. This is called a Whippletree in... I don't know what, in mechanics. I guess I know this as a Whiffletree. Some people call it a Whippletree. It has a technical name for mechanical engineers, I'm sure. But if you think about like how you attach 2 horses to a carriage, you put like a bar between the 2 horses and you tie the carriage to the middle point. And then if you're like, oh, I need 4 horses, you just take another one of those bars and you put it at the end of the first bar. So you have one bar with 2 horses on it, another bar with 2 horses on it, and then they're connected with a bar with a line in between. And you can just, if you go one more iteration out on this, you get the working principle of this vise. You may have also seen these in like your windshield wipers. There it kind of has a V-shaped bar that has 2 little V's at the end. And that allows it to conform to the strange shape of your windshield as it goes and washes across.
Oh, that windshield wiper is a great illustration of this because you know, right there you have a non-flat surface that you need to apply even pressure across. So that's a lot easier for me to understand than the horses because it's like pushing a rope with the horses, right?
And that's a little bit what's neat about this vise, right? Is that it's a push Whiffletree and the horses is kind of a pull Whiffletree. I guess the windshield wiper is another pushing one. Yeah, so it's exactly right.
Yeah, so how to distribute even pressure across a varied area. Yeah, that's great.
Across an odd shape. And the answer is each one of these little fingers does an approximately equal amount of pressing. Chris was inspired by a video of hand tool rescues where he took apart and repaired a really old version of this vise. And Chris thought, oh, dude, that's so cool. I just have to make one. And some people are more into these kind of restoring old tools videos. I know Mike is super into them.
Hand tool rescue has my number on this, Elliot.
Exactly.
In fact, when I go practice and I do the same warm up that I've done for the last 25 years of my life, I put on hand tool rescue and watch the latest video because there's no speaking in it, right? So I don't need to hear anything, and you just watch him take like really strange tools that are broken in some way and completely take them apart, take the rust off, which is one of his shticks. And put the whole thing back together, replacing, refurbishing and replacing any parts, which often means fabricating things. And he came up with this antique fractal vise that is actually made out of metal and, goes to the extent of polishing to a mirror finish the surface so that you can't like feel any difference between the parts of the Whippletree.
I think the coolest part of it for me, of course, you get to see him take this thing completely apart. And so you see all of the inner workings of it. And I think that made Chris's design work a lot easier, right? Because here he's got this video showing you how this thing is built. He didn't have to redesign it himself from scratch. And what's even funnier is that Teaching Tech, another YouTube 3D printer channel, saw Chris's design, saw the original design, and went and made yet another design. This one is, I have to say, Teaching Tech's version of this is by far the most printable, and from like a 3D printing design for manufacturing standpoint, is just a beautiful piece of work. If I were to print one myself, that's the model I would use to do it. But what I thought was really incredible about this is looking at the dates here, each one of these videos refers to the other one, going back to the Hand Tool Rescue one. Hand Tool Rescue's video came out on June 24th. Chris Borga's came out on June 30th. So within a week, he had made a 3D model of this. And then Teaching Text comes out essentially a week later, July 9th, and is a refinement of Chris's design of the Hand Tool Rescue version. And it's just insane to me how quickly the kind of global hive mind of clever 3D printing designers is iterating these days. It's just like, oh, look, here's a good idea. Oh, here, I'll take a stab at it. Oh, here, I'll fix that up. I just love seeing this, and I'm astounded by the speed that this went from, hey, here's a dissection of a tool, to here's a beautiful, functional, and relatively easy to print version of it. Go team.
You know, I've thought the Hand Tool Rescue would be a great guy to try and get to SuperCon to talk on this. Like, have you heard of Babbitt bearings? He has, so Babbitt bearings are like, it's an alloy. Think of it as like, I don't know, lead, right? And so you basically put the outer sheath and the inner shaft in place, and then you pour this hot metal in there, and it forms the bearing around that surface like perfectly. And the thing is, when it wears out over time, you can't just buy a new bearing to pound in there. You have to take it out and pour the new one, and like,
melt it and pour more lead in. That's awesome.
Yeah. And he talks about that whole process. I'd never heard of the Babbitt bearings before, and I was like, this is awesome. So like, just kind of, it would be awesome to hear him. It'd be awesome to see how many times I can say awesome. It would be great to hear him talk about how he approaches problems that he hasn't seen before, and like how big the encyclopedia of mechanisms in his head actually is. Well, a little earlier in the show, I was talking about RTL SDR and listening to some signals on the airwaves. James Wu had a project recently where he grabbed an RTL SDR to listen to some signals coming from his body, Elliot. This is a really interesting medical sensor. It's a Bravo reflux capsule that is sewn into the esophageal tissue near your stomach, and it's only in there temporarily. And it sounds awful to think about them doing that and then taking it out again. But it used to be, for this, they would put like a nasal tube down your esophagus and let that sit there for, I don't know how long it needs to sit there and collect readings. But it's looking for the pH of the stomach acid coming up your esophagus. And when James was having this put in, he was asking about it, as any geek is going to. And someone said that, oh, it's like Bluetooth. But, you know, that's for like the layman. And so when James went to look up on the website what the thing actually was, he saw that there was an inductor on there that was marked 433. And sure enough, when he went to look on the FCC website, he found out it's on the 433 megahertz band, which is totally common for small wireless devices, and went down the rabbit hole from there, sniffing out the signals, figuring out how to unpack them and decoding them so that he can get directly at the data coming from this implantable sensor.
That is crazy. I use 433 for like all of the cheap power switches in our house, like on and off and stuff. I would never have expected that it's inside a medical device, but at the same time, I guess it's low enough frequency that it gets out pretty easy.
It does and it doesn't. So the interesting thing is he looked at the chip has really poor efficiency. And then if you just wrap the transmitter in human flesh, that's not great for the signal being able to travel. And so he says it's good for privacy because you have to be pretty darn close to where that is actually implanted in your body to get at it. But it's squawking out every 12 seconds. And he grabs a program that we've talked about a few times on the show called RTL 433. And like you're talking about GNU radio before, can just like decode those packets on FM radio. RTL 433, if you know what you're looking for as far as the data, which we do because there was an FCC report on it, you can put that in and it'll just very nicely display those packets as they come in, which is an awesome way to deal with it. Unfortunately, you can get the numbers that way, but then you got to figure out what the numbers mean. And that's where another hack, someone else had one of these and wanted to read from them. And so another hacker had figured out that you're actually getting 2 pH readings every time it squawks out in order to kind of keep the data rate up, but save on the battery life.
So does he have the receiver part for this that, comes with the stomach sensor? I mean, he must if it's logging the data as it gets broadcast out, right?
Yeah, and I think that's what the picture on the top of the article is too. And you look at it and it's someone like motioning towards their throat with like frantic lines coming out.
Terrifyingly medical.
Yeah. And then there's someone that looks like there's something coming out of their mouth. I don't know if that's vomit or if it's like the heat of the heartburn. And then there's a heart with a lightning bolt through it. So it tells you a pH right on there. It's got a time on there. But you could see how kind of that rudimentary, every person's sensor that you want people to know what's going on, but you don't really want to scare them, doesn't necessarily tell the whole story of the data that's coming in. And so I'm really glad, James, that you went down the rabbit hole on this one because it was so fun to read through it and to learn from your experience.
This next hack, fixing noisy measurements on an O1 XDM 2041 bench multimeter, is maybe an example of bad tools, but then an example of what a good hacker can do to fix them. Even if you don't have a bad multimeter, though, there's an interesting principle here that you can learn from that will be applicable to any kind of data acquisition, analog to digital conversions that you're doing. So let's dig in. This bench multimeter, it's just a regular old volt and ohm meter, was giving horrible results. And the banner photo for this is him holding the plugs in his hand and it's showing on the screen an erroneous 40 mega ohms of resistance between these like unconnected leads, right? So Pateri takes the thing apart and wonders what it is. What he finds is that the device itself has been cost optimized by someone who maybe doesn't know what they're doing. At the heart of this is a GigaDevices MCU and then a multimeter chip, specifically the HY3131. And so he looks at the data sheet for this and discovers that inside this meter is exactly the reference design with one exception, and that is that the reference design calls for a particularly strange crystal to run the thing, a 4.9152 megahertz crystal. And instead, the manufacturers have gone, 4 megahertz crystal, close enough, and plugged that in instead. What this turns out to be doing is completely ruining the instrument's precision, because this 4 megahertz sampling frequency isn't a multiple of the line voltage frequency where he lives. He lives in a 50 hertz country. That means that it's taking these samples irregularly with respect to the phase of this background noise. And so if you think about like a sine wave, right, it kind of goes up and then it goes down and then it ends up right back where it started again. If you sample across a complete cycle of the sine wave, sometimes it's a little bit too high, sometimes it's a little bit too low, but it averages out really nicely. You're good to go. If you sample over a duration that's a little bit longer than one cycle, or if you sample over a duration that's dramatically shorter, you can imagine only catching the peaks and then only catching the troughs and then only catching the peaks again, or catching, a cycle and a half. So you get 2 ups and 1 down, and that doesn't average out to 0 either. And that's exactly what's happening here. And if you look at this graph he has that Maya picked up and put into our article, you can see it happening. There's this kind of almost regular looking noise pattern that shows up there. And his fix? He just switches out the crystal for the right one. Problem solved.
So wait, is the green line after the fix?
Purple dots are before the fix, and the green line is the correct value afterwards.
That is dumbfounding.
Yeah, so there's this huge spread from like 9 mega ohms to kind of 10 mega ohms. So there's a 10% spread in the pre, and then afterwards it's just flatline right on.
How could this thing get out of QA at the factory?
Because nobody did QA at the factory.
Yeah, you would think there would be an automated measurement against known sources that would just verify over a few seconds that you were getting all of the right measurements, and the purple dots show it shouldn't fall in there.
I remember the first time I ran into this, I had a light-dependent resistor, and I was reading its value off of an ADC, and reading again, just its instantaneous value. And in a room with fluorescent lights, you would get readings that were high when the fluorescent light was firing and low when the fluorescent light wasn't firing. And so I got this huge noisy range there until I kind of averaged out over, this was back when I was living in America, 1/60th of a second. And boom, all of your 60 cycle noise just drops right out when you do that. So the real story here is if you have poorly manufactured devices, you can swap out the crystal. Most of us don't have poorly manufactured devices, but it's still worth thinking about when you're sampling something with an ADC, if you're sampling over the right time period to knock out whatever kind of bad background noise you don't want in there.
The next one's an entry in the Hackaday prize this year. Raspberry Pi cameras stand in for stereo microscope. Tom Nardi wrote this one, and it's exactly like it sounds. Instead of getting a stereo inspection microscope, FabLab München is using a Raspberry Pi camera, a set of Raspberry Pi cameras, to provide 3D images, and then puts those up onto a monitor that's capable of displaying 3D, and you wear the polarizing glasses in order to see one image with one eye and the other image with the other eye. Elliot, I think this is a really interesting take on things, and I kind of wanted to discuss it with you because I know that you have a stereo microscope, right?
Absolutely.
And so I would think that there's a big difference between the optical microscope and putting the video together like this. And it would make sense that like the cost of getting, a few $100s for a used stereo microscope, if you're lucky, or you can put this together with a couple of Pi cameras and this Pi board called Stereo Pi, which we looked at back in 2018 because it was bootstrapped in order to make it possible to connect two of the cameras to this. But if you have a nice big screen up in front of you and you're kind of doing like the heads up thing with these polarizing glasses on that still allow you to see like the rest of the world, it might actually be a good use case versus, being locked into the microscope with the two eyepieces.
Yeah, what I really like about the kind of actual light and glass lenses microscope is that it's easily portable and you can carry it around with you, and it has very low latency. It takes femtoseconds for the light to get up into your eyeballs from the source, right? Versus a lot of these cheaper USB camera microscopes, there's like 50 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds lag, which when you're moving your fingers around trying to solder something, takes a little getting used to. With some of them, it's so bad that they're unworkable. Others are, these days, fast enough that it's really not a problem. I like my scope because of the portability aspect, and, it's nice to not stare at a screen for a second. That said, I don't have a stereo monitor and a pair of polarizing glasses to look at it with. If I had a 3D monitor, you can bet I would be doing this. It's just such a cool idea. Once you have the image in a computer, you can do all sorts of interesting measurements on it and stuff like that. So this really does open up a lot of other possibilities that just a simple regular light microscope doesn't. I think it's also really interesting from a technical angle. This isn't so easy to do because the regular Raspberry Pis only have one camera adapter on them, and that was kind of the point of this Stereo Pi thing. The chips themselves have two camera lanes, but only one of them is broken out on the normal Raspberry Pis. But on the compute modules, both of the camera lanes are brought out to pins. And so what you need is a breakout board for one of the compute modules to do this. And then that opens up the world of stereo, and in this case, stereo microscopy. This is FabLab Munich. These guys are around the corner from me. I really need to go over there and try this out hands-on, because like you could take a picture of a 3D screen and put it on my monitor, but it doesn't help me at all. So I gotta go see it in the flesh.
Yeah, and there's a conversation in the comments on this one about the high quality camera. That's the newer release of the Raspberry Pi camera, because it adds to it that C-mount lens, which lets you use a bunch of different style lenses. And someone mentioned for like 23 pounds, you can buy motorized zoom lenses for these things. And so even if you're not going to use it for an assembly microscope, it might have some other uses, especially with the ability to do that automated zoom I'm not sure if you could do like 3D images that used, what did they call that? Like focus stacking? Is that what they call it?
Sure.
So you get a better focus throughout. I think that it's just an interesting platform to look at right now, and I wanted to talk about it on the podcast.
Oh, dude, if I had a 3D TV, I would be all over it. My last hack this week is really ridiculous. Matthias Kram, is there any limit to what demoscene people will pull off? The answer is no. This one is a Commodore 64 demo. It's got video, it's got sound. The only thing it doesn't have is a Commodore 64. This is a Commodore 64 demo that runs entirely on the Commodore 64 diskette drive. And how does it do that? Well, it turns out that the diskette drives actually have a 6502 processor in it, in addition to some motor driver chips and a little bit of memory. And that's where the hard work goes on here. This one's called Free Spin. You should really go watch it. It pulls off the classic demo tricks. I look at the demoscene stuff as being just proof that when you kind of apply arbitrary constraints to people, they will turn them around and become creative with them. Because there are some like weird quirks of the floppy drive here. Like it goes silent every once in a while. It has some horrible clicks and stuff. And if you read through Matthias's write-up of this, which is actually broken into 4 different chunks, when he's talking about the sound design, he's like, yeah, I couldn't work around this, so I just wrote the music to have these pauses in it. Anytime he wanted to make a silence, it would stop the drive and it would go click a little bit. And he found these clicks to be annoying. So his workaround was to send it off to a really high frequency so that it wouldn't stop, wouldn't make that click. But then, of course, it's so high that you couldn't hear it at all.
The opposite of silence.
Yeah, right? The video for this is just so awesome. The disk drive connects to the computer with like a DIN 5 cable, and then the computer connects to the monitor, and he runs his bootloader on this thing, gets the bootloader running on the floppy drive, unplugs the two, cuts one of the cables in half, and twists a resistor in there between one of the lines and the other. The secret to getting video here is that he's using a kind of 2-bit DAC in that he has the clock line and the data line coming out of the floppy drive, and he puts a resistor in one of those so he can kind of get 3 values, which is enough to give you sync, black, and white on the video. And all of the audio is the floppy drive motor going zzz, 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 zzz. It's lovely. To really fully understand this hack, and I think I don't, you have to dive into, among other things, the forbidden opcodes of the C64 series. I'll throw a link to the extra opcodes, the secret opcodes in the show notes. He ends up designing a special sound box so he can record the sound of the hard drive. It turns out that he can't get his camera sync for recording the video to work with the demo because his camera doesn't record at 50 hertz frames a second. It actually records at 49.23 hertz.
Ooh.
And so he rejiggers the demo to run at 49.23 hertz so that he can get a nice jitter-free image for the video. And then he speeds it back up to 50 hertz. This means he has to run the audio when he's recording the audio at 50.095 hertz.
Oh, that's awesome. I totally didn't even read the recording page.
There are 100,000 little details in this project. I wanted to go through all of them. I'm totally out of time. You absolutely need to dig into this if you want to see how a small demo can be done with every possible I dotted and T crossed.
First up on my list of quick hacks, home automation for fans of quick and dirty solutions. Make It With Me came up with this one, and we've seen a ton of light switch automation things over the years where you just take a replacement plate for the switch and you maybe epoxy a servo motor on there, and that servo motor can make the switch move up and down. The problem is that this is a dozen light switches in one panel, and so this actually makes a gantry to move the servo motor left and right to select whichever switch it is that you want to automate and then flip it with the servo. Next up, a retro-tectacular, the secret life of the electric light. Dan Maloney wrote this one about a remastered special that Tim Hunkin aired back in the 80s about basically the history of human light making. And it starts with him by a campfire pulling out a flaming stick. It ends with him lighting up a fluorescent light bulb, and it does everything in between, from arc lamps and incandescent lamps to halogen and neon. Finally, we have Linus Akeson doing a dial-up SID, or a dial-a-SID is the project. He picks up an old rotary dial telephone, you spin the dial, and you get chiptunes out of it. If you're ever looking to do an exhibition audio project, this is a great place to start.
My first quick hack this week, Ian Charnas has a Tetris handheld powered by a tritium cell, eventually. The clickbait version of this is that it's a nuclear reactor because those little tritium lights light up because of radioactive decay. The truth here is that it's actually an awesome exercise in energy harvesting. The little tritium vials put out a tiny bit of light, and he's collecting this light with solar cells, trying to harvest it in a battery. Ends up using these bizarro thin film solid state batteries that I'd never heard of. First iteration doesn't work because I think he's probably got leakage currents floating around on the board somewhere. These solar cells are producing microamps of current, so you have to store that very carefully. But in the grand finale to the video, he lets it charge up for a month and can play Tetris for a full hour on a Game Boy clone. Next up, an entry in the Hackaday prize, responsive paintings, do it with heat and light. Laura has been experimenting around with gel-based thermochromic pigments and has made a painting that changes color as you look at it. It's absolutely marvelous. It's a study in kind of abstract color, form, and space. You should go check it out. Last up, human following utility trailer. This is a capstone project by Theo Gaultier. It's meant to be a tractor that can kind of follow you around and carry a medium heavy load. His idea is to help people out in the field harvesting things. They can just put it in this robotic follower and it'll schlep them for you. I really like that idea. He gets it almost working. I think this one is rife for some improvements on the human following side, and maybe just needs beefier motors and some more batteries to go with it. And this is something that I want when I go to the grocery store to carry my groceries back home.
It's time for our Canvas Articles of the Week. This is long-form content written by excellent Hackaday authors, and this week I've picked one by Dan Maloney called Black Starts, How the Grid Gets Restarted. This came out of the recent Texas power outage back in the late winter, where apparently it could have been a much bigger emergency if the grid had gone completely down. And if that happens, you're at the point where you need to do something called a black start. You need to get the generation facility to go from being completely dark, generating no electricity at all, back up to generating electricity that is synchronized with the rest of the power grid. Now, it's interesting because we've talked a little bit about this tangentially. Like, I know Brian Cockfield had written a couple of articles, one on the Argentina power outage and another on grid usage across the United States that mentioned the black start. So when Dan came and talked about this, I was like, well, yeah, we should definitely dig into that. But it ended up being so much more interesting than I would thought it was going to be. First of all, just for the event itself, Elliot, he pulls up an article that talks about how really close to a catastrophe we were in that emergency. The quote from the article, it's a Wall Street Journal article, is, "The system stayed below 60 hertz for longer than 4 minutes until ERCOT ordered additional blackouts. 9 minutes in such conditions could have been enough to damage power generators and other equipment, resulting in uncontrolled outages that could have caused the whole grid to fail." And it's kind of frightening to think about that. But one of Dan's first points in this is that the power grid throughout the world is perhaps the largest and most complex machine that we've ever built. The engineering knowledge and the expertise that goes into keeping these things running is incredible. But what we're really talking about is what happens when they completely stop running. And in that case, you need a generator for your generator. And in some cases, you need a generator for your generator for your generator.
So these things are not like permanent magnet generators. They have both the rotor and the stator are electromagnets, and that's where you get into trouble because you need electricity to make the field to make more electricity with these machines. And so that's why you need a black start generator to start up your main generator. Apparently in this event, a number of these like sub and pre-generators were also not necessarily ready to go. Like 9 out of 13 generators designated as primary black start units were found to be not working. And 6 of the 15 ones that were backup black start generators were also not working. And so this is a case of like a lot of the security blanket here wasn't being maintained or tested, or, you know, I guess they just weren't worrying about it. And that's one of those things with safety backup systems, right? You don't worry about your backups until you do.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, that comparison, because I don't test my backups, but
No, never.
I also don't have, millions of people relying on me.
I'll test my backups when my system goes down. Come on.
Yeah. Well, I was interested to read into the excitation circuits in these generators because I hadn't been familiar with it before. So I went and looked at a bunch of stuff. So it seems like there are coils on the iron core of the rotor that they need to run some power through in order to start generating the magnetic field that makes the machine produce electricity. And then it siphons off some of that electricity back into those exciter coils. So if you have a tiny bit of magnetism when you start, oftentimes the generator can build itself up and get itself going again. But the problem is, like you said, you don't have the permanent magnet for it. So what you're relying on is that iron core has some like residual magnetism in it, which is true if it's been running recently. But if it hasn't been running recently, then that can kind of peter out to the point where then you need the backup. And so interestingly, these are so big. It's like you think about a generator that you can just like lift up into the back of a pickup truck, but these are generators the size of a factory, right? And so you oftentimes will need a diesel generator that can then start a generator that runs off of like fuel oil, and then that generator will spin the main electricity generator to the point where it can get up and self-sustaining on, natural gas or coal or whatever the primary fuel for that plant is. In this case, there were enough backups and the decisions were made in Texas to have the rolling blackouts to the point that the entire grid didn't collapse, and that's awesome. And I think at this point we can just look at the learnings that can happen from this event and use it to bolster the grid so that the next time we have really unexpected or really adverse weather, our infrastructure is more robust against it.
All right, this next article is near and dear to my heart and near and dear to your heart if you are a listener of the Hackaday podcast. Tom Nardi wrote up the continuing saga of the Muse Group continuing its tone-deaf handling of the Audacity audio editing software, and this podcast is proudly brought to you by Audacity.
What?
It is. I use it to edit our podcast together.
Like they're a sponsor. You should say it's proudly edited using the open source tool Audacity.
This podcast is edited entirely on Audacity. So without Audacity, we would not be coming into your homes, directly into your ears right now. Actually, we totally would. I just use different audio editing software.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've used Kden Live a few times, which is for video, but it does audio as well. So shout out to the awesome maintainers of that platform as well.
There's a lot of great software out there, and I think that is actually part of my take on this story. But first, let's talk about the news here first, and then we can do some navel gazing about the state of open source software. Basically, Muse Group had bought the Audacity code base / trademark, I guess, and served notice that they were going to put out a patch that did some telemetry and reporting back to help them improve the software. That caused a bit of a kerfuffle a few weeks ago, and that got kind of smoothed over with the open source community. But then things got significantly worse Muse put out a new contributor license agreement asking everyone who has code submitted under the GPL to agree that they could have their code relicensed by the Muse group to some other code license. And
like unspecified code license. Like,
to some other code license. And that's where it gets a little bit creepy. In particular, the GPL has this love it or hate it, has this kind of viral nature to it. If you use someone's GPL 2 or 3 code, you then have to license the code you use it in also as GPL 3. And that means it's always going to be available. And I think a lot of the people contributing to the Audacity project liked this idea that their contribution to Audacity is helping keep Audacity always open and have its source code always available and freely available to everyone. And so when this Muse Group company comes in and says, oh, we'd like you to change this to some other license, it's most likely that what they mean is to some other license that allows us to close source the code base. And this raised more than a few feathers. And so there was a lot of back and forth on this. And Muse, again, kind of tone deafly suggested that they would get consent from the biggest contributors and just kind of rewrite the code to whatever license they want for a lot of the small contributions. And of course, this makes everyone who's submitted a small patch feel like it's a slap in the face, right? It feels like, haha, we don't care about you at all. We're just going to clean room, redo your work. And yeah, so that's a kind of an ugly move toward the people who developed the software. And then bringing it home, the last and weirdest twist here is that to comply with GDPR and America's COPPA, this is probably related to their telemetry issue, which had been buried before. They changed their licensing to say that people under 13 who were not old enough to give consent to be monitored couldn't use the software at all. And that really makes everyone think, what are they going to be doing with this data? And they say they won't share the data except as necessary for law enforcement, litigation, and authorities' requests, if any, which of course is the state of the law in most places. If the government says we need to see some of this data, if you're a company operating in that country, you don't really have all that much choice anyway. So they kind of had to write this in their privacy policy. The problem is Muse is located in Kaliningrad, Russia. And the law enforcement agencies that would be asking for this data are probably the GRU, the former KGB.
Yeah, I think that I think tone deaf is a really good description to put in the title of this, because I think if you go and look at a lot of different online things, they have the rules for COPPA in there, right? The 13, this is not for use by 13-year-olds. And like you said, if law enforcement comes knocking, the companies can be compelled to share a certain amount of data with them. I think the bigger issue is, why is your audio editing data being collected?
And ostensibly, it's to figure out what the cause of the crash was, right? If there's some incompatibility with other software you're running, this would be really useful information for the developers to have. And I totally see that.
But it also has things like IP address. It could have, presumably has timestamps in that. So if you want to put a person in a particular location, I think you can see why this becomes something that might be seized by law enforcement. The other thing is people talk about opt-in versus opt-out on the telemetry. So, some programs ask you if you want to be included. And the thing is, people don't turn that on. They usually don't say, yes, I will turn this on. And so
because they don't, by and large.
So companies choose to have it turned on by default, and then savvy users turn it off and everyone else doesn't. And that raises an issue of privacy, especially privacy where a company is making this decision on a tool that for decades has been built with volunteer work. And I think that's where you can start to see people get sour feelings on it, especially considering that there was already one instance with the licensing changes that kind of got, people defensive. And then you have these other things come through, and it seems like some people feel like the company is probing to see how far they can push the open source developers on these things. The looming question is, there are forks. Are the forks going to do anything? And I think in speaking with Tom about this when he was working on the piece, he said he feels like Audacity is too big to fail. So if you fork it off into something called Tenacity, some people are going to go and use that. But the SEO for Audacity is so good that just your average gamer looking for an open source audio editing tool is always going to find Audacity. So really, in my mind, this is a battle for the hearts and minds of the developers.
I don't know. I think the fork's going to be just fine, actually. My guess is that a lot of the developers to whom the Muse group says, we don't value your contributions, we want you to change the license that you've been committing under, we want to close source your code, will be maybe bitter enough that they'll move over to Tenacity. I mean, why wouldn't you, honestly? And the only thing that Audacity has over Tenacity, they're the same code base, is minus the telemetry that you maybe don't want, is the name recognition. And of course, you're right that there is this huge factor. But as soon as, the word gets out on the street that Tenacity is the one that's going to be the new Audacity, people are free to switch. I mean, it's hard to get over this kind of fixed cost of the name recognition. But if distributions start including Tenacity instead of Audacity and it's the same stuff, but without some anti-features, everybody's just going to switch over.
I don't know, look at OpenOffice versus LibreOffice. OpenOffice doesn't even have a company pushing it anymore. It's just kind of parked at the Apache organization, I think. Yet that's still downloaded all the time, especially for non-Linux users. Even though LibreOffice is worlds ahead of it. And now if you look at Audacity versus Tenacity, the plan for the Muse group would be to still have Audacity in active development and to be promoting its use. And so I think that really kind of muddies the water on people trying to figure out, well, what's the difference? Which one should I use? And to us right now, looking at what's going on in the developer community, we get it. But I think the further we get away from this moment, the less it's going to be clear what's the deal is.
Yeah, maybe so. I guess I have too much faith in the ability of the open source software world to kind of root around this kind of damage by just fork it, write it right. And I also have faith in the kind of developers to move over to the project that's doing it right.
That's all the time we have for this episode of the Hackaday podcast. As always, we'd love to hear from you. You can leave a comment in the show notes, which you'll find at hackaday.com/podcast. You can email us, editor@hackaday.com. We live and die by the tips that you send us, so if you see something cool or you've done something cool, we want to know about it. tips@hackaday.com. And until next time,
keep on hacking.
What should we do now? Whippletree. Is that too much W?
So he ends up repacking the data, which means writing a custom driver. It's...
I think the world may never know. Oh, shoot, that's not even on here.
Yes, it is.
It is on here, right there.
Oh, shoot.
Wow, I was doing so well.